So good morning. If this is your first time here or your first time back in a long time, I'm Reverend Charles Perry, and I'm the senior minister here at Unity of Birmingham. And before I begin my message this morning, I just want to kind of tag on to one of our announcements, and that's about the meeting we're going to have shortly after the service with the parents of our middle school and high schoolers. If you're not the parent of a middle or high schooler, but you're interested in being part of our youth and family ministry, you are welcome to join us, both to find out about what's going on and to, give us some feedback. So, please feel free to join us downstairs in Beverly Hall after the service. So before I begin, I also want to thank everyone who was here last week for holding space for me. I kind of had an emotional day at the office. And, that happens to us. I've had a couple of days where I've walked up here and had a reaction that I had not planned on. My talk immediately after Robin Williams' suicide, I remember, was one of those days. But I want to thank you all for holding space for me. And just as we've been discussing as we talk about Finding Yourself in Transition, which is the book by Reverend Robert Brumet that we've been studying in the messages on Sunday these past few weeks and studying in our Wednesday night class. Just as it says in there, sometimes you kind of have to be broken open by part of your experience in order to make it to the next level, whether it is a stage in your grief or simply the next quantum level in your journey as a human being. And, certainly it felt like that happened to me. It was difficult getting through last Sunday, but, Monday was a new day. And I felt better than I have in a long, long time. And, I'm very grateful for all the love and all the kind things that people have said to me and all the prayers that I know have been said. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. So when last we left off, we were talking about the last of the three stages of transition, which is new beginnings. And since this is the last Sunday I will be speaking about this, just to kind of recap, the process of transition begins with an ending, I can say that. And very often we want to kind of try to jump from the end of something because we tend not to like endings. They feel like failure. We want to try to jump right into a new beginning, but we do have to spend some time in what we call the void first, that sort of empty place that in the Bible was represented by the Israelites wandering in the desert, until they were able to make it into the promised land, and that is a new beginning. So what we're looking at right now is something that's a little more on the macro level. For each of us, we have those endings, time in the void, new beginnings. Sometimes at a very micro level. But we are also experiencing transition, in community. Certainly we are in this community. Here in Birmingham, in Alabama, in the United States, and quite frankly, as a species. There are transitions happening and transitions that are in the very beginning phases that we are all seeing at a very large level. And many of them are going to define what we become as human beings and whether or not we survive. And I don't mean to be alarmist, but that is a very real way of looking at it. In the 9th chapter of that book, one of the people that Robert quotes is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who is a Jesuit priest and a paleontologist. And what he describes is the fact that the universe essentially exists for the evolution of consciousness, that all that we see around us is simply a vehicle to drive the evolution of consciousness forward. Now, this is very different from the old Gnostic point of view. If any of you have studied some of the Gnostic texts and, gone further back into old Gnostic theology, the Gnostics felt that the physical universe was essentially an accident, and it was a byproduct of the thought process of God. But this idea that the universe that we are in, which is a constantly changing and evolving universe, that it is there both as a result of our evolution in consciousness and to enable our evolution in consciousness, is a bit of a new idea. In classic unity theology, we always talked about the absolute and the relative. And what that meant was, in the early days of unity, we talked about the physical universe and all the things that we do in it as being part of the relative realm, and that is those things which change. And then we referred to God and all of the things, the attributes that we gave to God, as being unchanging, unchanged, and unchangeable. And there are still people, there's still unity ministers who are standing up in front of their congregations, probably this very morning, saying that. And that's not the only way of looking at God and the universe. There is another branch of theology which is emerging that we refer to as process theology, which essentially defines God as a process, as something in evolution just like the rest of us. And when I define God as the universe, everything in it, all that lies behind it, and the laws by which it operates, it seems very clear to me that the universe is changing. Not only is the universe changing, right now it's expanding, but the rate at which it is changing is changing. The rate at which it's expanding is increasing. So at the most fundamental level, God is getting bigger, right? And the expansion of our consciousness may not just be a byproduct of that, but a driver of it. Does that make sense? So, looking at the huge, cosmic picture, when we think about our journey through all this change back to our oneness with God, what some of the physicists are talking about now, and I hate to tie theology to physics, but this is really fascinating. What some physicists are talking about is that the explosion of matter at the beginning of the universe may very well have been caused by another universe collapsing into a black hole and all of its matter being pushed out into this one. And that what will eventually happen to this universe is that all of the matter of this universe, which is currently still expanding, at an ever-increasing rate, it will eventually all collapse billions and billions of years from now, don't worry. It will eventually all collapse in on itself. Now, when we talk about becoming one with God, truly one in spirit, one in consciousness, one mind, one experience, that idea of everything coalescing into one singularity might very well be the best physical expression of what oneness looks like. And the result of our eventual oneness with God will be both the ending of this universe and the birth of a whole nother one, which I think is really cool, right? But it changes the way that we look at God. Instead of looking at God as something that cannot change, we start thinking, maybe I'm part of God changing. Maybe my consciousness, as I develop consciously, as we all develop consciously, maybe we're part of the development of God consciousness. So it kind of changes the dynamic. Now, what he also describes is the fact that at certain points along the way in development, we reach these crisis points. And what we have the ability to do in those moments of crisis is to either make a leap, make kind of a quantum jump, or we fail. We fade away. We die off. I was looking back at the history of human species And it's interesting what scientists think about the Neanderthals. They died out about 44,000 years ago. But you think about this. There was a whole race of other humanoid-type beings on this planet. We carry some of their DNA, but not a lot. Some scientists think that they were assimilated. Others believe that they were simply overtaken by another group of hominids whose name I can't pronounce, but it comes from a cave somewhere in France where they found a bunch of their stuff. Maybe I won't make jokes about French military victories and how long ago the last one was. But it appears that at some point there, when those sort of two versions of humanity were coexisting, some kind of crisis point came along, and one of them developed, and one of them died away. And so for us today, in almost every crisis we find ourselves in, we have a similar choice. We can jump to another level in consciousness, or we can simply stay where we're at. Now, fortunately for us, I guess, when we have those times that we don't make a jump, essentially what the universe does is it gives us a do-over. How many of us have said, why am I having the same relationship again? Why am I stuck in the same job again? Why does the same stuff keep happening to me? It's because whatever that thing is, whatever that stuff is, whatever it's doing to us, when we have that chance to jump a level, we're not getting it. As somebody in recovery, and I know that there are several of us in here, we all know what it was like to wake up with that hangover or whatever it was again and wonder, why can't I get this? Until the day we do. And everything changes. Everything. And that's a good thing. But what it requires at some point, and especially at the point we're at now, is for us to not only realize I'm changing and I'm evolving, but for us to be a part of it. Barbara Marx Hubbard, who is, I think she describes herself as a futurist, is quoted in here, and I really love this quote about conscious evolution. She says that conscious evolution is the world we place on the evolutionary map. The innovation needed now, and this rest of this is kind of italicized, is to understand the magnificent processes that created us and purposefully cooperate with them in planning and designing our own future. And then she says, it is essential for survival. So I say those words, conscious evolution. And, in our mechanistic, industrialized society, that may have taken on a whole new meaning for some of us. For some of us, the idea of conscious evolution might involve gene splicing, So let me be clear. What I'm not talking about when I'm talking about conscious evolution is maybe injecting myself with, frog DNA so that I don't have wrinkles anymore and my skin is nice and moist. Not talking about that, all right? I'm not, right? I read not too long ago that in 20 years, nanotechnology will render even today's medicine completely obsolete as leeches and bleeding seem to us today. Now, that sounds really awesome, unless you're a fan of Star Trek. When I think about injecting myself with nanotechnology, I start getting a little nervous. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, in Star Trek The Next Generation, they introduced a villain who was probably the biggest villain in the Star Trek universe. They were called the Borg. And Borg is short for cybernetic organism. And they were a group, they weren't even a race, because what they were a multitude of races who had they'd had technology through nanotechnology, embedded into their bodies, and they went out into the universe assimilating other species and other technologies, and they kept putting them into their bodies. And they developed kind of a hive mind because all their minds were connected. All right? And when I think about where we're headed, well, right now we have Google Glass. You can put on glasses that let you see the images that someone is beaming in. How far are we from Google Cornea? Right? How far are we from being chipped? My dog's chipped. Right? It ain't that far. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about conscious evolution. Now, I love technology, okay? So I'm not saying, I'm not any kind of a Luddite, but what I'm saying is that what we need to do as a species is evolve in consciousness and not try to do everything with drugs and gizmos. Amen? One of the other people that Robert quotes basically says that where we reach an evolutionary dead end is when we deaden ourselves with everything from antidepressants to television to sugar to whatever it is that numbs the pain you're feeling and stops that pain from getting you to evolve. Because if we don't feel pain, we are not motivated to change. I know that before I went into recovery, I had to feel enough pain to change. Because otherwise I just would have stayed with the pain that I knew and stayed with my own means of dealing with it, ineffective and harmful though it was. It was what I knew, it was what I was comfortable with. And that's what happens to so many of us. We reach that ceiling. We don't get any further because we're afraid of what lies beyond. So unless we begin the process of conscious evolution saying, okay, I know that what is happening to me right now hurts like hell, but I'm going to feel the hurt. I'm going to allow the loss to move through me. I'm going to grieve as long as I need to grieve and as loud as I need to grieve, and I'm going to get to the other side of this thing. And I'm not going to try to depend on a crutch. And I'm not going to shove it back into the recesses of my subconscious. I'm going to look it square in the eye. I'm going to deal with it, and I'm going to get to the other side and see who I am there. So then we take a look at, well, how are some of the ways that this is possible? What can I actually do? So when we understand that all of life changes, that maybe even God changes, that the universe changes all around us, the way that we can find that place of stillness, the way that we can come to peace with it, is by moving with it and living in it. There have been times in meditation recently when I have tried to sense the movement of our world. I'll lay back wherever I am and remember that the earth is spinning at about 1,000 miles an hour. And as it's rotating on its axis, it's revolving around the sun at several thousand miles per hour. And the sun is dragging us through the cosmos at I forget what it is, 67,000 miles an hour, whatever it is. It's a fairly large rate of speed. And then I start to get the bed spins like I used to when I drank. And I'll put one foot on the floor and try to stop everything from moving because it gets a little weird. But in my most still space, I am changing position at a rather high rate of speed in several different directions all at once. And I think that's a great analogy for where we are in consciousness. We are changing. And so to become still with it is to enjoy the ride, to make peace with it. I don't know if anybody noticed, but I'm not wearing my family service flag today. I'm wearing a little key. How many of you remember what these keys are? Anybody? Got one of you? Yeah? Flashback to a little over a year ago, we did a series called The Keys to the Kingdom, right? And those who made it all the way through the class and graduated got a little key pin. I know nobody's going to remember what are all the keys to the kingdom, right? Well, the last one was living in the flow. And that's what we're talking about, being the real secret to dealing with a life that constantly changes. How we can find ourselves in transition, find out who we really are, find out what our purpose is, find out what life is all about. It's living in the flow. And as we look at what is really required of us to live in the flow, some of those keys to the kingdom come back to me. Making a commitment to being a giver to life. Holding a vision for what is yet to be. Living our truth. Being willing to participate in the cycle of giving and receiving. Learning how to forgive. Being in gratitude every single day. These are all ways that we make peace with the universe, that we work with the universe rather than trying to constantly swim upstream. So the way that Robert talks about in the last chapter of finding yourself in transition is known by a bunch of different words. And he begins using a word that my history and theological studies professor hated, and that's the word surrender. Dr. Tom hated it because he also spent 20 years in the Army, and we don't surrender in the Army. I've made peace with the word surrender, but that's simply because of my other family of faith. But when we use the word surrender in terms of our consciousness, in terms of the work that we do, we're not talking about waving a white flag, giving up, and just saying, I don't care, I'm done. We don't become doormats. But what we stop doing is fighting what is right now. We may decide, I'm going to do something to change it for tomorrow. But I stop being angry with right now. I stop resenting right now. I stop hating the people who made now. And I say, okay, this is what is. Now, what's the next best thing I can do? What do I need to do to go on from here to get to a better tomorrow? What is mine to do? Even though things may look in a way that I just don't like right now, what can I do about it? And sometimes, honestly, the only thing we can do is maybe hold people in prayer, send our love out, because there are some horrifying things happening around the world right now. Just horrifying. I saw a movie called Machine Gun Preacher. And it's about a guy that becomes a preacher, and he hears about bad things going on in Africa, so he goes off and he grabs a machine gun, and he defends an orphanage in Africa from the bad guys. And I'm not deploying anytime soon, but sometimes that's not ours to do, What surrender really means is I can allow this moment to be this moment, whether I'm really fond of it or not. Last week or the week before, I talked about the difference between addiction and preference, right? And this is a big piece of it. If I can simply say, I would have preferred it if it were different, that's different than saying, I can't be happy because of the way things are, right? That's the opposite of surrender. That is something we call resistance. And as the Borg would say, resistance is futile. And it really is. All resistance does is stops us from living in the flow of God's good for us. And it keeps our minds from opening to being aware of all the possibilities that we could have if we were not stuck in our own anger and resistance to what is right now. So, what Robert says we need to do is to move out of resistance and into acceptance. We could say non-resistance. Acceptance is a great word for it. And I love the way that he kind of puts it all together when he says that the continuous practice of mindful awareness combined with an attitude of non-judgmental acceptance will eventually dissolve all resistance in consciousness. I love that phrase, non-judgmental acceptance. Boy, it really makes you do your homework, doesn't it? I mean, there's acceptance, like, well, yeah, okay, I guess. But I'm still being all judgy about it. Right? And at a certain level, that is still throwing resistance out to the universe. When I am simply able to say, you know what, may not be what I'd have preferred, but there are obviously things going on in the universe that I'm not aware of. I'm going to trust God. I'm going to ride this one out. I've read part of this at least one other time when I was talking about acceptance. This is from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's from one of the stories towards the end by a fellow who had to learn what acceptance meant to him. He says, and acceptance is the answer to all my problems today. When I am disturbed, it is because I find some person, place, thing, or situation, some fact of my life, unacceptable to me. And I can find no serenity until I accept that person, place, thing, or situation as being exactly the way it is supposed to be at this moment. Nothing, absolutely nothing, happens in God's world by mistake. I usually end there, but I want to read a little bit more. He says, unless I could accept my alcoholism, I could not stay sober. Unless I accept life completely on life's terms, I cannot be happy. I need to concentrate not so much on what needs to be changed in the world as on what needs to be changed in me and my attitudes. That's conscious evolution. Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. He forgot to mention that I was the chief critic. I was always able to see the flaw in every person, every situation. And I was always glad to point it out because I knew you wanted perfection just as I did. AA and acceptance have taught me that there is a bit of good in the worst of us and a bit of bad in the best of us. That we're all children of God and we each have a right to be here. When I complain about me or about you, I am complaining about God's handiwork. I am saying that I know better than God. Yeah. That is the kind of non-judgmental acceptance that we need to truly become fully aware, fully in the flow of life, fully living from moment to moment in partnership with God, evolving consciously as God consciousness evolves. When we are able to do that, we truly can find ourselves in transition. Please join me in prayer. Sweet Spirit, today we give thanks for this opportunity to come together, to learn, to grow, to share, to be in community with those who are willing to walk this path with us, to consciously change and evolve, to let go of judgment and resentment, to accept that, like the little caterpillar crawling across the carpet, we may not see what all those colorful lines mean. But when we have changed, when we have evolved, when we are the butterfly flying above, we see the pattern. We understand. We accept. And we may even be able to appreciate the beauty of it all, no matter how crazy it seemed when we were crawling. Thank you, sweet Spirit, for giving us the opportunity to grow wings and fly and be one with you. So it is. Amen.